Right.
Okay, joining us now, we have David Meiswinkle. He is the President and Executive Director of Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and this is a very, very busy time for him. I was just talking to him off air, and he said they were up till 3 o'clock last night. They've got events coming up tomorrow. And of course, they've been working on this for decades. But, this is the 20th anniversary, and so everybody wants to revisit this and talk about this. And we always need to take the opportunity to talk about what I believe and what I've been saying for the last hour and a half is a seminal false flag event that has been used to alter our society in so many different ways. So joining us now is David Meiswinkle, President and Executive Director of Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you, David, for having us.
Tell me a little bit about what's coming up. You've got an event that is coming up tomorrow in case people want to follow that as well. Tell us about that first.
Right, they can get get connected to that at lc4for911.org. We'll be doing a 9/11 20th anniversary event, a commemoration. Ed Asner was going to do the welcome, and as you know, Ed just passed. He was a board member of ours.
Yes.
And so we'll be dedicating the event to him and also to the victims of 9/11 and their families. We'll have a little dedication at the beginning of the program. But we have Rainer Fulnish. He'll be calling in from Germany. He's doing a lot on the with regards to the COVID and the alleged pandemic we're experiencing. And there'll be speakers that can connect that. Whitney Webb, she's an investigative journalist. She'll be talking about the parallels between 9/11, Anthrax, and the present pandemic. We'll have people that will strictly talk about the 9/11 itself. Commissioner Joy, a fire commissioner, he'll be there. Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son in the North Tower, he'll be speaking. Graham McQueen, who is a professor from Canada of 30 years, expert in 9/11. Kevin Ryan, a whistleblower, a scientist, and others. There'll be Merle Nash, she's an expert in anthrax. She'll be talking. Francis Boyle, who is actually the world's expert on biotreaties. He developed in 1989 the United States bioweapons treaty, at least his language. And Mick Harrison will be there, myself, Barbara Honecker from our committee, William Jacoby, and as I mentioned, I think I did James Corbett will be presenting also. And I hope I didn't forget anyone. I think that's most of the people, but we'll be talking about a lot of important issues, beginning with 9/11, of course, and connecting it with the anthrax attacks, which happened at basically the same time as a bioweapon attack, and with what some perceive as a bioweapon attack right now in reference to the COVID, and the vaccines may be even worse.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, you're mentioning, did we lose him? It kind of froze up there. I think we still got him on. Are you still there, David? Can you hear us? I think you need to recontact with him. Of course, he talked about Rainer Fulnick in Germany, Francis Boyle in the U.S., and other connections. Is he back? Are you back? Nope, we're still getting him. Okay, other connections.
David.
Okay, good, he's with us. Okay, good. Yeah,
Now, this is Mick.
Oh, okay, Mick. Good. Thank you for joining us, Mick.
Sure.
And you're working on litigation. I was just saying the people that are being brought into this, and I've talked to you before. I've talked to David before about the connection with the anthrax attacks and the new investigations that you guys are doing in that. And I think they're very tightly linked between these two things. But even if you don't see the linkage, you see the parallel usage of this. Talk to us. You're the litigation director for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Tell us a little bit about some of the upcoming litigation. We just heard from David about the events tomorrow on the 20th anniversary. Tell us about litigation.
All right, I think we have David back, by the way.
Okay, good.
How you doing,
right.
Mick? How you doing?
Okay, good. We got both of you on now. Okay, but tell us a little bit about litigation, Mick Harrison.
All right. So we have a petition before the U.S. Supreme Court at the moment that some folks don't know about. The Supreme Court has not yet decided to hear the case on the merits, but it's on a petition for certiorari that's been docketed. So this is regarding our lawsuit against the FBI and the Department of Justice. The lawsuit was filed in D.C. It related to a second 9/11 commission that a lot of folks don't know about, the 2013, 2014, 2015 9/11 Review Commission, which was chaired by Ed Meese. And the purpose of that commission was to evaluate all evidence regarding 9/11 that the original commission had not looked at. Now, Congress issued a mandate in 2013 for the FBI to do this new study of all the evidence. The reason we sued them was that it was basically a whitewash. They didn't look at the new evidence. They just pretended to look at the new evidence.
Wow.
So we looked at, all the evidence of the demolition of the Trade Center towers we talked about before. We looked at a number of other categories of evidence, including the Saudi connection, which is in litigation, as everyone knows probably now, in New York for the families. Mm-hmm. And what happened was the district court decided that whether we were right or not about the evidence and whether we were right or not about what Congress intended, that because Congress didn't put its explicit intent about doing this report to evaluate all the evidence into the actual language of the bill, but just put it in legislative history, which was abundantly clear, that basically the FBI didn't have to issue a report to anybody about this study, including the Congress itself, and therefore we had no standing to enforce the requirement.
So they created a review commission, but since the court says, well, since they didn't have anything saying that they had to do anything, you don't have any standing to say why didn't they do anything. They just there was no purpose to the commission then, right?
Yeah, and it cost a couple of $1 million to the taxpayers, but they didn't have to report their findings to anyone, even about the worst crime in the history of this country, terrorist crime. So we found it basically an irrational decision. We appealed it to the D.C. Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Unfortunately, that Court of Appeals issued a decision under some unusual circumstances that agreed with the district court that we didn't have standing. Those unusual circumstances included participation on our 3-judge panel by a judge who is now the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland. In other words, the judge who is now heading the agency we were suing. And what happened with that was that we had oral argument scheduled in the case after we'd briefed it. And Judge Garland participated in the decision shortly after that to take away the oral argument, to rescind the scheduling of the oral argument. And then the decision was issued as an unpublished decision, which got a lot less of fanfare. And in the meantime, Judge Garland was publicly being considered as the nominee to become Attorney General during the same time, and did become, of course, the nominee and was confirmed. We asked for the D.C. Circuit to do a disclosure of exactly when Judge Garland knew he was a nominee to become Attorney General in the suit, during the suit we were litigating against the agency he was to become the head of, and the court refused to disclose any facts. So that is also now, in addition to the standing question, an issue before the U.S. Supreme Court. So I'll stop there. We have other litigation, but I'll let you ask questions or go to David.
So yeah, what you're talking about then is essentially you're saying a conflict of interest for him because of his involvement there, being put in as head of the Department of Justice, and then they're coming back and saying that you have no standing, and that of course, nobody had any standing to do anything with this commission. Is that kind of an accurate summary of this, more or less?
It is, and that includes, as David is often explaining, that we had a family member, Bob McIlvaine, as a plaintiff in that case, and the court decided that even he did not have standing to complain that the 9/11 evidence wasn't evaluated as Congress mandated. The conflict of interest issue is a little more disturbing even than you framed it, David, because under the law, a judge has to recuse themselves to withdraw from a case, even if there's an appearance of impropriety, and that legal standard doesn't turn on what the judge knew at a particular point in time. It turns on what the public knew. And because the public knew that Judge Garland was a candidate to become Attorney General from press reports during the time he was on our panel making the decision to take away our oral argument, which led to the unpublished decision, there's not too much of a question in our mind that standard was violated.
Oh, yeah. If the public knows it and everybody's talking about it in the papers, of course, he's going to know it, too. He doesn't live in a vacuum or under a rock. He's going to know that everybody's got it. His name is up for that. And, of course, they've been talking to him about that before. It's absolutely amazing as we see this being pushed to the side. I talked earlier about the fact that, Sheikh Khalid Mohammed is 20 years, and they still haven't had a trial about that. It's just amazing how they have swept everything aside, swept it under the carpet. But we had a lot of suspicious activity surrounding the Anthrax attack that, David, as you mentioned earlier, it happened right alongside that. We had a simulation, Dark Winter, that is exactly the formula for what has been done to us for the last year and a half, run by by Johns Hopkins and the CDC and the usual suspects. And then 2 months later, you have 9/11, and a week after that, you have the Anthrax attack. And then 2 months later, you get the legislation sent out to all the various places. Talk about the Anthrax attack. I had you on a few months ago, and you had there was a lot of skepticism about the sloppy investigation work that was done at the time, put in by the mainstream media like the New York Times, Washington Post, and others. But you have opened this back up, and you guys have done your own investigation. You found, dug deeper, talked to people who were there at the time, and it is far worse than what people talked about in the aftermath of that with the New York Times and Washington Post. Tell the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's correct, David. We believe that Bruce Ivins, who was a scientist that worked at USEMRID, was basically an innocent man, that the evidence wasn't there to convict him at all, and that the investigation was obstructed by the FBI and corrupted, that they lied to Congress and misled them. We believe that the suspects, at least the line of thinking, would have been up through Dugway Proving Grounds and Patel Memorial, who had contracts, secret contracts at that time with the CIA. This anthrax was the most sophisticated anthrax that was ever seen at that time in this country, and that was 1 trillion spores per gram. That was what was sent to U.S. Senators Leahy and Daxel. We've asked, and Mick is about ready on behalf of the Lawyers Committee, because we just met last night. We're ready to file a new paper, and he can update you on that. It's going to be down in Washington. It's going to be with the U.S. Attorney there, asking for a grand jury petition on this whole matter. We submitted it earlier to Congress, so Congress now is up to date on it. We're going to update the U.S. Attorney, but we're also going to be asking for a special counsel, and Mitt might be able to go into that, because we believe there's a conflict of interest that the Justice Department cannot investigate itself because of this obvious conflict of interest. We believe that the smoking gun. Oh, Dave, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, just to give people the an overview of what happened, if I recall it correctly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but when this first came out, they were saying, well, this is coming from Iraq, and we need to go attack Iraq. And then they realized, as you pointed out, this is very, very sophisticated, so this couldn't be Iraq. And not only that, but it was a particular type of weaponization that could have only come from two places. Both of those had connections with the CIA, but instead they focused on a third lab, and then they focused on a person at that third lab, Bruce Ivins, and they came after him for years. They eventually said that he committed suicide, so case solved, and we stop it. And so you had a lot of media that was concerned about that. You guys went back and you interviewed people that had worked with Bruce Ivins, and you pointed out, as you were just talking about, the fact that it was very, very sophisticated, highly weaponized, that it could only have been done at these two places that were not investigated. And so now what is happening with this in terms of a legal standpoint?
Well, Mick, you want to follow that?
Sure, Dave, thanks. So tomorrow, at the latest, we're going to file a grand jury petition with the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia. But as Dave says, we're also going to ask the Attorney General, who happens to be Merrick Garland, former Judge Garland we were talking about. We're going to ask him to appoint a special counsel to handle our petition and the grand jury inquiry for the very reason that Dave articulated, which is the FBI and Department of Justice should not be asked to investigate themselves. Now, why do we say they would be investigating themselves in the anthrax attacks? Well, that's an important question. It's detailed and documented in both our petition to Congress and in our grand jury petition coming up. The short version, David, is, as you may remember, the FBI focused on Dr. Ivins after discarding other suspects that they couldn't prove up a case against. And the argument they made against Dr. Ivins was primarily a DNA evidence-based argument. And what they were saying was that they did, at the time, state-of-the-art DNA testing, called PCR testing, of anthrax samples from 20 or so labs around the country. And they said that the only lab that had what they called the fingerprint morphs, which were certain DNA patterns that the FBI found in their tests. They said the only lab that had the match for the fingerprint morphs was Dr. Ivan's lab at Fort Detrick in Maryland. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem with that, as we discovered in our investigation, is the FBI covered up evidence that would have pointed to the facilities you mentioned, which would be Battelle and Dugway Proving Ground, the Army's facility in Utah. And they did that in a very clever way that very few people would have picked up on. And we had to dig in the details, not only of the Army's evidence and the FBI's evidence, but also the National Research Council's evidence, the NRC. And they did a report on this, paid for by the FBI, but it didn't turn out to be very flattering to the FBI. Okay, so what happened was that somebody in the FBI decided, or maybe one of their consultants, that they would only look at samples if they were what we call viable samples or live samples. It also turns out, conveniently for Dugway, that the samples they provided to the FBI of their anthrax were non-viable or dead samples. Huh. And so they didn't get tested. Okay. Now, why does that matter? Okay. It matters because Dr. Ivan's stock of anthrax, we call it RMR 1029 because that's what they called it. It's a code name. It was 85% composed of anthrax provided by Dugway and 15% anthrax that Dr. Ivans produced in his lab, which he called RMR 1030. Both of those stocks got tested, RMR 1029 and RMR 1030. And because they were at Fort Detrick, they were viable samples, they got tested. And what did the FBI find in doing those tests? That Ivan's contribution to the flask at Fort Detrick did not have any of the fingerprint morphs, none of them. But RMR 1029, which was 85% Dugway anthrax, had all of them.
Wow.
Now, think about this from the point of view of the Sherlock Holmes expression, when you eliminated the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth.
Yes.
There are only two components to that flask, Ivan's and Dugway's. Ivan's tested negative. The entire flask tested positive. So where did the anthrax fingerprint morphs come from in the flask? There's only one possibility left. It was Dugway.
Yeah.
But their samples didn't get tested. So that's why the FBI should not be investigating itself here, because they're involved in the cover-up with that key evidence.
Yes. And so you're hoping that they're going to appoint a special prosecutor. And, of course, the problem with all this is that it, again, is Merrick Garland at the epicenter of all this. But ideally, there would be, in a better world, we would have, and what you're asking for is an independent prosecutor, because the FBI are the ones that did the cover-up. Is that correct?
Well, yes. And Dave may want to comment on this, but, I have still some cautious optimism that Attorney General Garland will do the right thing on this and appoint the special counsel. We did not get the disclosure from the U.S. Court of Appeals, so we don't actually know what Judge Garland knew when. It's possible he participated in the initial decisions and then recused himself from the final decision on our case, which is what the decision suggests, which means he may have had that appearance of impropriety and should have recused, but he may not have had an actual conflict of interest because he didn't personally know. Mm-hmm. And so he may not have engaged in impropriety, which means he still may have an open mind about this controversy. And if that's true, he's going to do his job as Attorney General, because there is a regulation from the DOJ which says under these circumstances, a special counsel should be appointed. I think there's a reasonable chance he's just going to do his job correctly and appoint one.
Yeah. Well, it's a very serious case because of all the different things that were involved in terms of precedents. And we had people who died as part of those anthrax attacks. How many people died with that?
Five people died from that, David. 17 were injured. And what's key, too, in addition to what Mick said, the FBI concentrated on the fingerprint morphs. We discovered that not only was Bruce Ivans had access to that 1029, but hundreds of people did. And in addition, at Fort Detrick, their specialty was not a dry powdered anthrax, which just was very sophisticated. What they did was a wet anthrax for their vaccine studies. So this is a total different operation to order to do this. What they found was that a simulant called B subtilis, which is really a fingerprint, and that's characteristic of Dugway Proving Ground, and they're fermenters. Commonly, when we looked at these studies, they were always contaminated with this B subtilis. Then you have the silicon, which is another fingerprint. That's really indicative of Battelle and their experiments with the anthrax and their sophistication. Then there's tin and things of that nature, which are other signatures, which the FBI doesn't even mention. All they do is concentrate on this RMR 1029, which hundreds of people had access to, but they don't tell anybody that. They don't tell Congress that. They just throw everything on Ivins, Bruce Ivins. As we said, he was the scapegoat, unfortunately, unfortunate person for that.
Yeah. And so there's several fingerprints. Some of those had to do with the delivery mechanism. Isn't that correct?
Well,
I can speak to that, David, if you want.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think the delivery mechanism you're referring to is turning the normally wet anthrax into a very fine dry powder that is easily disseminated through the air. And in this case, the mechanism turned out to be letters posted through the mail, which were much more effective in distributing anthrax than people would have guessed, because apparently the high pressure mail sorters forced the very fine anthrax particles out of the pores of the envelopes, even though they were sealed with tape.
Wow.
So the mechanism in this case, which is what Dave is explaining, is, there had to be a sophisticated processing of this anthrax, which could not have been done at Fort Detrick, where Dr. Ivins was located. An interesting twist on this is initially when the FBI tried to publicly convict Ivins without a trial after his death, when he couldn't defend himself, they basically, focused on, we're convinced Ivins snuck around in his lab late at night and made this stuff. Well, what did the FBI say in the litigation in Florida when the Stevens family, one of the unfortunate victims of the attacks, sued? And the government's witnesses said, well, it couldn't have been negligence at Fort Detrick because we didn't have the equipment there that it could have been used to make this anthrax.
Wow.
So they essentially backed off of the accusation that Ivins could have made it at Fort Detrick. Later, in a low profile set of affidavits in the federal litigation, didn't get much press attention, but it just totally undercut their case.
So we have a situation here, with murder, 5 people dead. There is no statute of limitations on that, but this is even bigger than that because there were so many different policy implications with this. We wound up having an anthrax vaccine that was forced on a lot of soldiers, and there were a lot of injuries or deaths with that anthrax vaccine, as well as policy implications. I would expect that this would happen, but we're not seeing any, the press by and large is not paying any attention to this, are they? I mean, we had the New York Times and Washington Post when this was rolling out, and then again when Bruce Ivins died, they covered the stories, but they're not really covering this at this point in time, are they? Or are they? Are you getting any other press coverage?
Not that I know of. Maybe Mick knows that. Basically, the press coverage is back at that time around 2008, I think, where the New York Times was talking about a new investigation. The Washington Post was saying the same thing. Congressman Nadler, Congressman Holt were asking for that. I think Senator Leahy and Grassley were asking for the same thing. But remember, they closed it down before the National Academy of Sciences made their reports. And then the Government Accountability Office made a report. Those reports did not jive with what the FBI was saying. They did not agree with them, with their science. Their science, the FBI science, was the key thing that they hung on to say that Bruce Ivins did it. But the science, even the scientists didn't agree with them. So for that reason, it should be totally opened just for that DNA type of analysis, but for much more.
Yeah,
I think, David, sorry, David, to answer your question about the press, there was a lot of press early on, as Dave points out. The New York Times asked for a new investigation. The Washington Post asked for a new investigation. Some time has passed, and it's gotten to be more of a cold story, but we're hoping that with this new filing tomorrow, that the Washington Post and the New York Times and some of the senators will be, how should we say, reawakened on the issue. Keep in mind, this was a biological warfare agent attack on the U.S. Congress intended to assassinate two United States senators,
Yes.
Senator Leahy and Senator Daschle, at a time when they were, how shall I say, raising concerns and slowing the vote on the Patriot Act, which is an interesting coincidence if it is a coincidence.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is very interesting. And of course, they're all about attacks on Congress. You would think that this would be a topical thing, but with the 20-year anniversary coming up, with the focus on domestic terrorism and insurrection. But I think that is a very significant aspect of this, that you just mentioned, the fact that you got two senators who are a bit skeptical on this Patriot Act, and they happen to be the ones that is addressed to. I mean, it's very suspicious. Hopefully, you're going to get some traction with this. Tell us a little bit more about your organization and where can people find can they go to your website to see the events that are going to be happening tomorrow?
Sure, they can. It's lc4for911.org, and they can sign up if they wanted. The event will start at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and it'll go to 9 o'clock. So there'll be continuous speakers, and they can pick that agenda up basically if they go to the website. Thank you.
Well, you guys are doing great work and very deep investigation here. And as you pointed out, there's many different conflicting stories. You have the investigators came up with information that conflicts the FBI's conclusion, but they rapidly shut that down as Bruce Ivins dies apparently of suicide, and they rapidly pinned it on him and shut that investigation down before the other stuff came in. It needs to be opened up again. Has anybody done what about the suicide of Bruce Ivins? Has there been are there anything suspicious about that?
Well, we talked to people, and two people very close to him believe that he was murdered. All right. So we haven't been able to follow that up yet, but that's what they believe. Others say that he, they forced him to drink and to take pills or whatever, or take the Tylenol, and that he killed himself. We don't know that, but we know they put an inordinate amount of pressure on him. They made his life hell, and his family's life.
Yes.
So David, if I could add one note to that.
Sure.
So the FBI put a lot of their documents, not all of them, but a lot of them on the web in what they call the vault, a publicly available website. And we went through a lot of those documents in detail. One of the interesting things they show is Dr. Ivins, over a period of time during this investigation, prior to his death, was actually serving as essentially a whistleblower, pointing the FBI to who Ivins thought would have been the real suspects in the Anthrax attacks based on his inside knowledge of who would have the capability to prepare something this sophisticated in his field. Now, I'm a whistleblower lawyer. I represent whistleblowers. I've been doing it for 30 years. Looking at this pattern of evidence, it is significant, circumstantial, but significant, that Dr. Ivins dies under somewhat mysterious circumstances after he is essentially blowing the whistle to the FBI on who might really be responsible.
Wow. It is an amazing case, and we want to keep up to date with what is happening, so want to have you back on to give us an update as to what is happening with that. Give everybody the website one more time where they can see the events tomorrow and where they can follow up on this, because this is all foundational to everything that is happening to our country right now. What is that website again?
It's lc4for911.org.
Great. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us, and we certainly hope that you're successful in this. We need to have answers, and we need to have closure on these. Thank you so much. And just a couple of seconds that we've got left, I want to remind people, as we're talking about thousands of people, 3,000 plus dying on 9/11, another 5 people dying with anthrax attacks after that, thousands of people dying, American soldiers dying in Afghanistan, people injured with anthrax vaccines. I mean, the death and destruction that has gone on with this is just amazing, and people are still dying. People are still dying. People who were first responders at ground zero, people who were sent in without proper masks and ventilation to remove the debris quickly, to essentially cover this up. 20 years later, you've got people still dying of cancer, dying of COPD. In a review of nearly 18,000 workers and volunteers who climbed in the ruins in the hours and the days following the attacks, and remember, we had officials like Rudy Giuliani and others telling everybody, go ahead, it's safe, right? Researchers from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai discovered many have begun to develop COPD after previous asthma diagnosis. COPD is a chronic lung condition, causes breathing difficulties, coughing, wheezing. It only gets worse over time. And I've had a listener who used to call in for years at InfoWars, a victim of this. We still have the Victim Compensation Fund is still offering relief to 9/11 survivors. The death and destruction continues. The police state surveillance continues to escalate. And the contempt for our liberty still demonstrated by people like Joe Biden and the vaccine program. The common man. They created Common Core to dumb down our children. They created Common Pass to track and control us. Their Commons Project to make sure the commoners own nothing. And the communist future. They see the common man as simple, unsophisticated, ordinary. But each of us has worth and dignity created in the image of God. That is what we have in common. That is what they want to take away. Their most powerful weapons are isolation, deception, intimidation. They desire to know everything about us while they hide everything from us. It's time to turn that around and expose what they want to hide. Please share the information and links you'll find at thedavidknightshow.com. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. If you can't support us financially, please keep us in your prayers. thedavidknightshow.com.